Welcome back to the swamp, my friends, and welcome if you're new. Today I'm going to be sharing some creepy and allegedly true horror stories from the deep woods that'll freak you out tonight. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into these creepy and downright strange deep woods horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. This is a warning for anybody living or visiting Fairbanks, Alaska. Avoid the eastern side of the Farmer's Loop, and avoid Sheep Creek Road at night. Roughly about 10 years ago, I saw my first monster and I was driving home from the hospital with my mom. We lived in the middle of the Farmer's Loop. Since the hospital was closer to the eastern side, we took that side home. Almost right after turning on to Farmer's Loop, there is a clearing. Some may call it a field due to its size, but it's just a clearing. There is a big metal tower in the middle, surrounded by a forest in case you want to look for it. I was in the passenger seat, and it was dark that night, so my mom had the brights on in the car, and that's when we saw it. We were about to drive away from the clearing as we passed by the forest. At first, we mistook it for a dog, but as it emerged from the ditch and into the light, we were struck with absolute terror. It was a sight that haunts me to this day. A half-naked figure, crawling on all fours, its pale skin glowing in the darkness. My mother's screams filled the car as she accelerated, and I, just a mere child at the time, was absolutely overcome with fear. As we drove by it, this thing lifted its head and I saw its grotesque face. There were no eyes. It just had black holes where they should be. There was no mouth, but I could have sworn it was trying to smile. We only talked about it in the car that night, but I can't ever remember her bringing it up again. I have tried to bring it up to her, but she always says that she just doesn't remember. However, there's a look in her eyes that I can tell that she knows exactly what I'm talking about, and she probably knows what it is. That's part of the reason that we tend to avoid the Farmer's Loop. There is also a feeling that lingers on the eastern side of that road. It's almost like a poison. I have never seen a place transform like that segment of road. Before, it was filled with happy people who led good lives. Now it's filled with people who fake happiness, but you can tell something is just off. There's also a homeless camp out there called Dead Man's Cemetery, and you should definitely avoid it. If you go out there late at night, there is a man who stands by the road and just stares you down while wielding a machete. After 10 years of no monsters and almost being convinced that nothing wrong had happened over the last 10 years, something happened tonight that proved to me that the poison was genuine. I decided to go for a late night drive to that forest, which took me past that university and down Sheep Creek Road. A big flash of light was past the university, almost like an explosion. I thought of it when the next one came. 2 minutes later, the next flash hit. My car's tire light came on. It's been having some issue for a while now, so I decided just to turn back, go back to Fairbanks, and grab some air for the tire. I came around a bend looking for a spot to turn around. I saw the reason for the flashes of light. Beyond the hill, I could see lightning, but it didn't seem normal. About 6 of them were coming out of the sky from the same exact spot and then curving towards the ground before going outwards and touching down in random places. I thought it was weird and got my tire aired up. After getting air in the tire, I decided I was way too curious to go home and ignore the flash. So, like the idiot I am, I went back. The light flashes were coming every 3 minutes, and more people than I had ever seen were leaving their homes on Sheep Creek. I don't know what was going on. When I went around the bend from earlier, it got dark, and I don't mean middle of the night darkness. It was so dark you couldn't even see the road in front of you with your high beams on. The trees from that lightning bolt or whatever you could see were burned every time they were touched by it. However, I kept driving, Right before the main train tracks, when I was facing the hills the lightning touched down on, there was another flash. Except this one was big enough to light up the sky, and I could almost see everything like it was daytime. The light lasted maybe 10 seconds at most, and I could see what looked like the shape of a person in the lightning. From where I was, I could make out arms, legs, a torso, and a head. But after that, there were no more freaking flashes. I freaked out, and I raced home. So here I am writing this to you, and trying to warn people. Fairbanks, don't take those roads at night. You may come across a monster with no eyes, or the person in the lightning, and I'm pretty sure they are not friendly. The Katyn massacre stands as a chilling testament to the depths of human cruelty and the horrors of war. In the spring of 1940, amid the dense forest of Katyn, a sinister plot unfolded, leaving nearly 22,000 Polish officers and others dead in a brutal, harrowing display of calculated barbarity. As the world was embroiled in the chaos of World War II, Poland found itself torn asunder by the dual onslaught of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in a shadowy corridor of power in August 1939. This stands as a chilling testament to the betrayal and cynicism that lurk within the hearts of men. Crafted in the crucible of geopolitical ambition, this unholy alliance between the two of the 20th century's most brutal dictators unleashed a tidal wave of devastation and despair upon the world. At its very core, the pact was a diabolical pact between Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, an agreement born not out of friendship or mutual respect, but out of a cold, calculated pursuit of power and dominance. Behind closed doors, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop hammered out the details of this absolutely insane bargain that would shape history in not the brightest of ways. Central to the pact was the sinister division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. A grotesque carve-up of sovereign nations that condemned millions to a fate worse than death. Poland, already reeling from the onslaught of German aggression, found itself caught in a vice grip of betrayal as both Nazi and Soviet forces descended upon its borders with ruthless efficiency. But the horrors unleashed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not end there. The pact heralded an era of darkness and despair for Eastern European peoples. In the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Red Army swept across the land like a relentless tide, crushing all opposition in its path and subjecting the populace to a reign of terror and oppression. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, swiftly overpowering its defenses and annexing large swaths of territory. Among those captured were thousands of Polish military officers, policemen, and other members of the intelligentsia. Rounded up and transported to various prison camps across Soviet-occupied territories, these men became pawns in a sinister game of political expediency. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, carried out a meticulously planned operation to eradicate the Polish elite. Under the guise of special procedures, the prisoners were transported to the depths of the Katyn forest. They were subjected to a chillingly efficient execution. Bound and blindfolded, the victims were lined up at the edges of mass graves, their final moments shrouded in terror and despair. The crack of gunfire echoed through the trees as execution squads carried out their grim task with ruthless precision. One by one, the lifeless bodies of Poland's finest fell into the waiting earth, their hopes and dreams extinguished in a torrent of violence. But unfortunately, the horrors did not end here. In a macabre display of psychological warfare, the Soviet authorities sought to conceal their crimes by attributing the massacre to the Nazis. During the Nuremberg trials, which were a series of military tribunals held after World War II to prosecute prominent leaders of Nazi Germany, the Katyn massacres were indeed mentioned. The Soviet Union had accused the Nazis of the massacre, but evidence emerged during the trials that implicated the Soviet Union authorities instead. The Nuremberg trials brought international attention to the atrocities committed by both the Nazis and the Soviets during the war. While the main focus was prosecuting Nazi war criminals, the trials also shed light on other war crimes and human rights violations committed by different parties during the conflict. The revelation about the massacre in Katyn Forest at the trials underscored World War II's complex and often overlooked dynamics, highlighting the brutality and political motivations of multiple actors involved in the conflict. It wasn't until 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of long-sealed archives, that the full extent of the Katyn massacre was finally revealed. The discovery sent shockwaves around the world, laying bare the depths of Soviet depravity and forcing a reckoning with a dark chapter of Poland's history. As the Soviet Union was undergoing significant political upheaval and an untimely collapse, a series of events led to the exposure of a previously classified document relating to the Katyn Forest massacre. These documents provided concrete evidence of Soviet responsibility for the massacre, contradicting decades of Soviet propaganda that had blamed the killings on Nazi Germany. The Katyn massacre files, which included orders from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and other high-ranking officials to execute thousands of Polish prisoners of war, were leaked from Soviet archives. This revelation was a profound moment, not only for historians but also for international relations and the memory of those who perished in the massacre. The disclosure of the documents confirms that many had long suspected, but lacked solid evidence to prove, that the Soviet Union, not Germany, had completely murdered all of these Polish officers and intellectuals in 1940. The release of the files marked a significant step toward acknowledging historical truths and confronting the atrocities committed by the Soviet regime during World War II. These documents played a crucial role in shaping history, understanding, and prompting officials to apologize and to acknowledge that this has gone down. The Katyn massacre remains a poignant symbol of Soviet brutality and the complex history of World War II in Eastern Europe. Today, the Katyn massacre stands as a solemn reminder of how fragile human civilization can be, especially enduring legacies of tyranny. Amidst the tranquil beauty of the Katyn Forest, the silent echoes of those lost souls, and they serve as a haunting testament to the horrors of war and the capacity for evil that lurks within all of us. It was back in the 1980s. At the time, I was in my late 20s and I would often grab my collie, Lacey, and drive my Mustang convertible to the park not too far from our home to go hiking. Although I was a single female, I always felt safe hiking in that park. It was like my second backyard. It was a hot Sunday morning in July. There was a slight breeze and a beautiful blue sky. It was pretty early, around 8:30 a.m., and the park was deserted when we pulled up into the parking area. The parking lot was near the picnic area and restrooms, and it would get crowded later in the day when the families arrived for their picnics, and the fishermen would make their way out to the lake and try their luck at catching that elusive big one. This park covers 1,900 acres of land and has miles of wooded dirt trails that intersect each other. There are a few main trails that pass by a lake and meander along a lazy river and lead to 3 hidden, breathtaking waterfalls. It is heavily forested, and in the summer, when the leaves are all on board, the trail's visibility is limited to the path. I loved that park, hiked it often, and knew the trails like the back of my hand, and enjoyed having it to myself. I intentionally chose times when I knew it would be less crowded. The lot I parked in is across a little road from the head of my trail. It's my favorite trail. As I called Lacey out of the car and snapped on her leash, another car pulled into the lot. He parked rather close to me, and I found it rather annoying and a bit strange. I go there for solitude and peace, and there were plenty of other parking spots, and there was no need to crowd me. The trail Lacey and I wanted to hike on was across the road, so I headed that way. We started up the hill and onto a heavily wooded hiking trail. For some reason, I was feeling a sense of dread and glanced at the man as he was getting out of his car. I am somewhat suspicious when hiking alone and immediately found him a bit off. Something about him was setting off alarm bells in my head. He appeared to be in his 40s and was by himself, which is not unusual. A lot of people hiked by themselves. It was his attire and demeanor that caught me off guard. He was dressed like no other hiker I have ever seen. He had on dress pants and shiny black dress shoes, like the ones my dad would always wear going to church. The clothes and shoes were a bit shabby, but still not something somebody would wear when hiking. None of the trails in this park were paved. They were all dirt and often muddy since they crossed meandering streams. But it was his expression that struck me the most. He was staring intently at Lacey and I, with no expression on his face, and it was making me extremely uncomfortable. I thought to myself, who does that, and who wears dress shoes hiking? I began to think, and I became more uneasy. There was just something creepy about him. Most people who hike the trails keep to themselves, but will say a brief "Hi, how you doing?" or wave, something like that. This man simply stared intently at Lacey and I with no expression in his blank eyes. I knew somewhere deep down inside of me that it would be the best plan of action to avoid him entirely. It was a little voice in my head that I had to listen to. I considered giving up my hiking altogether that day, but I'd been looking forward to it, and Lacey was raring to go, and maybe I was just being paranoid. So I turned back around and began walking up the main hiking trail. I decided to verge off one of the many little paths that branched off the main trail. I chose this trail as it was not marked with any signage and did not go towards the falls of the river, but winded through the dense, heavily forested woods. It was not as popular as the other trails, and I figured I could avoid the man as he probably would choose one of the more popular marked trails that most hikers would. As Lacey and I walked along, I glanced around to see if I could still see him. To my dread, I realized that he had also chosen the trail we were hiking. I looked around to see if there were any other hikers out, but it was just him, myself, and Lacey. I was not concerned to the point of panic, but still somewhat freaked out. It was just himself, myself, and Lacey. I was not concerned to the point of panic, but still freaked out. I decided it was best to continue to steer clear of him, and as soon as I was able, I took a different cross trail to avoid him. The trail I chose headed off in an entirely different direction from the way he was headed. I kept walking at a fast pace, trying to put as much distance between me and him as possible. I tried to enjoy the gorgeous, beautiful day, but I could not shake the feelings of unease, and all the while walking tried to stay diligent of the man's location. After hiking for about 5 minutes, I began to feel my sense of unease increasing. I turned back to notice that the same figure, once again, was following us in the distance, gaining on us slowly but steadily. He had taken the same intersecting trail as Lacey and I, and was following behind us again. He did not appear to be enjoying the walk. He was not looking at the nature around him, just staring right at Lacey and me. He continued to stalk us at a quick pace with a sense of purpose into his stride. His face was motionless, his eyes never leaving us. As I glanced to him, it seemed waves of malice were emanating from him, and I was more scared than I had ever been in my life. By this time, Lacey was beginning to feel my anxiety. She was a beautiful dog and looked a lot like Lassie. She was a good 65 pounds and, unlike most collies, did not care for strangers or anything else out of the ordinary. She was also beginning to pick up on my emotions and starting to perceive this danger. She began stopping and turning, looking back at him, perceiving this person as a threat. I knew all of these trails like the back of my hand and was quite sure we could lose him. I crossed into another trail, and I thought surely we had gotten far enough ahead of him that he would be unable to determine which trail we had walked. Glancing nervously behind me, but much to my horror, when I looked up the trail ahead, I saw him walking straight towards us at a determined pace. He had somehow found the trail that circles around us and then crossed over to head us off. This could be no accident, It was obvious to me now that he was intentionally following us. But why? My brain went into overdrive. All of my senses were telling me that I was not in a good situation. I wondered what I could do. I had a very, very bad feeling about this man, and had to find an escape route and get back to the safety of my car as quickly as I could. I hastily looked around for another trail that I could take before he would reach us. There was nothing. Quickly thought it through, and determined that my only options were to turn and run back to the opposite direction, dash into the heavily forested woods, or walk right past him. I looked at him, judged the distance, and knew if I ran, even with his street clothes on, he could possibly catch me on the trail. I had no desire to run off into the woods as the grounds are heavily covered with tripping hazards, and I've watched enough horror movies to know that the running victim always trips and falls out of panic. I contemplated all of those options, and you are probably going to think I'm crazy, but I decided the best course of action was to keep walking straight ahead and walk past him. I was not alone. I had Lacey, and she gave me the courage to confront the alarming, disconcerting stranger. As we walked closer to him, he said nothing but kept staring at us intently with his blank, emotionless expression. His eyes were very dark and menacing. I walked nervously towards him, and as we got closer and closer to him, I began talking to Lacey under my breath, urging her on with a desperate voice pleading over and over, "Get him! Get him!" Lacey felt my fear. She felt it to her very core and fed off of it. She began growling low in her throat. The closer he got to us, the louder and more profound the rumbling from within her became. By the time we passed him, I was physically holding her off by her leash. She was lunging at him, snarling and baring her teeth. He did not react like someone being threatened aggressively by a dog. There was no resentment, no irritation. Strangely, he said nothing to me, and I said nothing to him. He passed by us and gave Lacey a wide berth, no longer looking at us or showing any interest at all. I lightly said, "That's not nice, Lacey." I was petting her and encouraging her to growl at him the entire time, though. She continued to give him the Clint Eastwood stare and kept barking until he was well past us. I kept an eye on him, ensuring he did not back away or turn back towards us. I was eventually relieved to see that he made his way to a trail that led to the parking lot. I got in his car and drove away. I continued my hike heading to a different side of the park. I kept thinking about the man and wondering what he had been doing. To this day, I think Lacey saved me from an awful situation. And when we returned home that day, I made sure she got an extra special treat. My name is Johnny. This story happened on June 29th, 2018 in the northern region of Florida. I was 21 years old, working as a beach photographer that summer with my buddy, who had just graduated from college. We both attended the same college in Pennsylvania. Our company put us in a 4-bedroom townhouse with about 10 other people. It was a Friday, and I had the day off. Everyone else was working that day, so I just sat in the house relaxing. As the day went on, I became more and more anxious because I had not done anything active. Usually, I walked at least 10 miles a day on the beach, taking photos of vacationers, and another day on the beach didn't sound as appealing as taking a break inside with the AC and some quality Netflix. But today, I felt I had been too lazy with my time, so I decided to go for a night walk throughout the neighborhood behind our housing development on this nice little nature trail. It's enjoyable to walk there at night, because it's always tranquil, and there is a lot of lovely foliage, mansions, etc. on this walk. I discovered a bike trail that I did not know existed before, and decided to check it out. It goes into the woods, and I thought, why not? Maybe being in the trees will remind me of home in rural Pennsylvania, and relaxed my mind. Little did I know, it would be the exact opposite. The bike trail runs perpendicular to the road and goes along a narrow field of power lines that cut through the woods. It goes for what I would guess about 15 miles at least. I was walking for 20 minutes, and all I could hear was the sound of nature around me. It was very calming, even though the woods always did give me that spooky feeling. It was a nice place to walk, or so I thought. Along my left was the tree line. To my right was the field with a line of telephone poles cutting through the middle of it, and much less thick tree line on the other side, with some swampy marsh areas. It was a full moon that night,
so I wasn't in complete darkness and could see pretty much all around me. So, about 10 to 15 minutes into my walk, some clouds came in and covered the moon. It got much darker out of nowhere, so I turned on the flashlight on my phone. I heard a strange noise coming from my right across the field. It sounded like a boar or a pig. It let out a long, low grunt. It didn't sound like the normal sounds that I was used to. It sounded like something had caused it distress. I stood there listening for another sound, but there were no more. I kept walking, hoping I wouldn't hear it again, as it did come out of nowhere, and it startled me. Instantly, I got the feeling of something not being right. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I was very unnerved. Like I felt like I was being watched. I tried to find where I was on Google Maps, but they would not load because the service was very weak. I eventually ran into another path that veered off into the woods, and there luckily was a map on a board beside it. I stared down the course for a few seconds, contemplating whether to take it. It looked like that cliché shortcut that looks super scary but gets you to your destination a bit quicker. This one was dark, and I mean dark. There was a thick canopy above. As this part of the woods, there was only about a foot between the dense trees and the path on both sides. Without the light of my phone, I would not have been able to see a thing in there. I decided to turn and walk along this path, as it was a quicker way home instead of going back and around the way I originally had came. Then, as I was about to head down the said path, I heard footsteps. I stopped and turned my flashlight off to listen. I wanted to make sure I wasn't being paranoid and scaring myself, but I could indeed still hear them. They were coming toward me from the direction I was headed on the main path. I ran over into the trees and hid because I wasn't about to run into some potentially crazy people out here in the woods. As I was hiding in the trees and waiting for them to pass me, I instantly smelled something terrible. I thought maybe I was just so scared that I soiled my pants, but that was not the case. Instead, it smelled like something decomposing. Like the smell of a dead deer carcass baking out in the sun. If you've ever been hunting, you definitely know that smell. The footsteps became increasingly closer. Then they passed me. I counted 3 people, or should I say silhouettes, and I couldn't make out their faces or even their clothes. They walked in a straight line, their heads staring straight ahead of them, and none of them said a single word. The one in the middle was dragging some sort of bag behind them along the concrete. I waited for about 5 minutes until I could no longer see them, hear them, or smell that smell anymore. I started walking down the dark path, slowly but surely. I tried walking quickly, but I wanted to stay quiet, as I was pretty freaked out. I was wearing flip-flops and they clicked my heels with every step, so the slower I was, the quieter I was. I walked for about 10 minutes, and I started to hear footsteps. Again. I stopped and turned off my flashlight. The footsteps were coming from behind me this time. I ran back into the trees and waited to see if those people were going to come back again, and inevitably, it was. They brought that awful smell back with them and walked past me the same way, dragging the bag behind them. Were these people following me? Why did they happen to turn around and come onto this path as well? I stayed out there in the bushes for about 20 minutes or so, unsure of what to do. I didn't know if I should keep going the way I was going or run back. I hoped they didn't hear me though. As I waited, they came by again. Which is the freaky part. I heard a man's voice say a girl's name, this time though.
Barbara Ann Wilcox.
Or something like that. I waited another 5 minutes and just started running down the path. I picked up my flip-flops to make sure I didn't make any noise, and didn't even turn my flashlight back on. I ran for what honestly seemed like 10 minutes until I eventually had to stop to take a breath. I was still in complete darkness, and I turned my flashlight back on to ensure I wasn't being followed. I didn't smell that horrible smell, so I turned the flashlight back off to save my phone's battery and not give myself away. I didn't know how much longer I had to keep going, as this path did not look nearly as long on the map. I began to hear sticks breaking in the woods. They didn't sound like footsteps, but somewhat random. One would break to the left, then to the right a few minutes later. Finally, they started to get louder, and eventually I bolted again. I ran, and I ran, and I ran. I was afraid that there would be something chasing me if I ever turned around. The sticks breaking seemed to follow along on both sides, not too far behind me. It was a fight or flight situation, and I fled as fast as I could. After what seemed like running for an hour, I eventually saw lights and came out of the woods next to a sewage plant. I hurried home along the highway. No one was home when I returned to the townhouse, as they had all gone to a beach party. So I sat down, got a glass of water, and searched the name I heard on Google: Barbara Ann Wilcox. This is where it gets strange. In a nutshell, Barbara Ann Wilcox and a friend were from Iowa, and they were hiking through Florida in the 1970s. On their trip, they were murdered by a man named Gerard Schaefer. The cherry on top of the cake is that it happened in 1973, and the skeletal remains of the girls were found scattered throughout the area, which is known as Oak Hammock Park, in 1977 by a group of fishermen. Why were 3 people, if that's what they were, walking through the woods at night in the pitch black saying the name of a girl that died 40 years ago, about 7 hours away in a different part of Florida altogether? And what the hell were they dragging behind them? I'm not sure if I want to know the answers. Throughout the rest of my summer, working in Florida, I continued to do my night walks, but I never went on that bike trail again. So, if you're ever alone in the woods, please be careful. You never know who or what you will find, or worse, who might see you.